Hello, darling students. So I am still not back yet, but I hope to be soon. I wanted to give this lecture to you guys. That way we could make sure we don't fall any further behind than we already have. But also, I thought maybe this might not be a bad idea to keep online anyway. This lecture is designed to have you guys have like a general understanding of some themes in US history. So like, let's just say there's an essay topic that you get and it's about, I don't know, political relations in America. What do you say if you have no specific ideas? This lecture can kind of give you guys some of like the general ideas or themes. So let's go ahead and go through it and see what some general themes in US history are. When in doubt, this is the story. Let's start with the role of government. So there's a big misunderstanding in America. Uh, Turns out the US government is intentionally weak as defined in the Constitution. So like if you were to actually read the thing, which again, most Americans haven't, but if you were to actually read the thing, the US government is actually relatively weak. And that's intentional. Remember, this government is created after the uh, monarchy and the concern about like an absolute monarchy over the colonies. So of course the government that is made is going to be weak. That being said, the fact that your brain kind of like itched a little bit when you wrote this in tells me that you're not used to the idea of America being weak. Why is that? Well, the story of the United States and the story of this class is the US government spending the next 230 years growing its power. The US government is perhaps one of the most powerful governments in the world today, even though it's written to be weak. The story of this class is how do we go from a weak government to a super strong government that we have right now? Now, let's talk about something else. We're going to spend a lot of time in this class discussing El Presidente, but it turns out the president doesn't have as much power as the other branches of government, specifically Congress. There's a lot that we think the president can do, but if you read Article 2 of the Constitution, it turns out the president can't do much. There's a lot of ire that we put towards any president, regardless of your political beliefs. And the thing is, if you read Article 2, that's not the president's job. Almost everything that our government can do comes from Congress. And Congress has not necessarily been the most effective at really any point in American history, but a lot of the blame goes towards our presidents. And I say that as when we teach this class, we kind of tell this class through the story of the presidents, and I'm going to do that too. But just know that Congress has way more power than the president does, even though we're going to spend like 90% of our class talking about history through the eyes of the presidents that we're serving during various events. Speaking of, let's talk about politics. Now, I personally do not care if you are a Republican or a Democrat. Doesn't matter to me at all. Maybe you're apolitical. That's fine too. Instead, I almost kind of want to go away from those terms though, because what's annoying in American history is that we have multiple political parties in America, but we really only have two political identities. For example, if you were to go back in time and talk to a Republican in the year 1863, I'm not so sure that Republican would agree with a Republican in 2022 because the political parties shifted pretty dramatically multiple times. So it makes it complicated when you're studying history knowing that the names of the parties change. So instead, what I like to do is look at the beliefs that the current political parties have today and give it a larger definition because the idea here is that the belief behind the name of the current political party pretty much always stays the same. So for example, conservatives typically, and again, this is a gross oversimplification, so just deal with it. They typically want lower taxes, smaller government, they tend to be more pro-war, they tend to be more pro-business, and they're anti-government regulations. Now, if I were to give you this definition, you would attach it to the Republican Party today, but that's not necessarily always been what the Republican Party that we're going to learn about in this class would have believed. Instead, what's easier to think about is like, what would a conservative want? A conservative wants a smaller government. Thomas Jefferson is a conservative, and he's going to want a smaller government. And that's going to be a big theme that we're going to see in this class, this idea of should the government have a lot of power or not? So that's going to be the conservative ideology. Now, the opposite of conservatives are going to be the liberal ideology. So the liberal ideology is attached to the Democratic Party today. Now, typically, Democrats want higher taxes. That way the government can provide more services. They are anti-war, they're more supportive of laborers, and they're more pro-government regulation onto industry and things. Now, the debates between these two groups have existed ever since the very beginning. And by the way, to make things really complicated, when Thomas Jefferson makes his political party that is conservative, he calls it the Democratic Republicans. So what party would you tie that to today based on the name? You can't count on the name, you have to go with the belief. Now, this fight between the liberals and conservatives has gone on like basically from day one. In fact, the whole fight of the Constitution is over the size of what this government should be and who should have that power in that government. There is a conservative and liberal fight from the very beginning before we even make the US Constitution. So for us, having these political parties separated by ideology rather than just name will make it a little bit easier. You'll see as we go. All right, moving on. Oh, hey, look. Names for these parties change, but the ideals stay the same. Maybe I should have the actually fully printed out notes in front of me before I just start talking. That way I know what you're seeing. Oh, well, next slide. Ooh, let's talk about bank panics. Now, this is actually relatively complicated. Let's talk about economic history really quickly. Now, currently, I am recording this in 2022, and there is a R word that's been thrown around a lot, this idea of a recession. So that means that the economy is going downward, right? And there's a concern that they could have long-lasting effects on employment and pay and everything else. But see, here's the thing. Those happen basically every 20 years. So if that's the case, like, how do they happen? Is there perhaps a formula or a general story for how these go down? Absolutely. And here is this panic. I'll tell you the story of the first panic and how it happened, but there's a couple operative words that you can change, and it ends up being the exact same thing for every future panic. All right, here we go. So the very first panic happens because land had become available for cheap out west. Don't worry, we'll talk about this when we get there. Now, certain people called speculators are going to buy this land and then sell it at a high cost to the next people to move there. So a speculator is someone that is going to be, I don't know, think of someone that would be invested in like GameStop or Bitcoin or whatever other current meme stocks there are. These are the kind of people that are like super into NFTs when everyone else thinks it's a scam. That's essentially a speculator. So land becomes available for cheap, and these speculators buy it and then immediately resell it to farmers at a much higher cost. That's step one of this story. Now, the speculators have been paid and they disappear from the story. Like all those Bitcoin miners, they're just gone. So we don't need to worry about the speculators anymore. But now we have these farmers. Now, these farmers are going to need to take out loans, probably at a pretty expensive cost, to be able to buy tools and seeds, to farm. Which means that these farmers are going to have to take on a fancy D word, debt. These farmers take on debt in order to buy tools and seeds. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. In fact, this is basically how the American economy works. Taking out debt isn't necessarily bad because it allows you, the farmer, to be able to work on your farm and use tools and make money, which you can use to pay off your debts. That's essentially the American economy. So step two isn't necessarily bad on its own, so long as the farm does well. As long as the weather holds out and as long as there isn't a drought or a famine or people decide they don't like potatoes anymore or something, as long as things are going good, there's really nothing wrong yet. It's step three where things start to go wrong. Something happens and the investment doesn't do well. So maybe there is a drought, maybe there's a famine, maybe there is a plague of locusts, maybe there's a flood, maybe, I don't know, there is a worldwide pandemic of some kind, and it makes it difficult to have any sort of labor done on your farm. Well, that's step three. And when step 3 happens is when everything starts to go wrong. Why? Well, what happens when a farmer can't pay back their loan? Well, they stop farming, right? Or in the worst case scenario, maybe the farm gets like repossessed, or the farmer has to declare bankruptcy. When that happens, the bank that made the investment in that farmer loses out on that money. And that bank, coincidentally, is going to run out of money itself. What happens when a bank runs out of money? Well, we call it a panic. So, if the banks run out of money and close, this causes everyone else to lose money. So, how does this happen? Okay, well, banks in America in the 17 and 1800s worked a little bit differently than a bank today. So the way a bank worked back then was that everyone in the community would have their money in one building, let's just say. And what a banker would do is they would loan that money out to various people. And then, when you took out a loan, you'd pay back the loan with interest, and that would keep the investments of the bank. That's basically how banks work. Now, what happened in the 17 and 1800s is when someone declares bankruptcy or when there is a problem in the land, what ends up happening is that that money just evaporates and disappears. The money that you put into the bank just evaporated and disappeared, and now it's gone. What people start to do is that they do this thing called a run on the bank. The idea being that people would go to the bank and take out any money that they could that they had left before the bank closed. And now the bank has no money, they can't loan out money to anyone, and now nothing's happening. So this is essentially what's known as a bank panic. It causes the economy to crash. Now, to put it in even simpler terms, let's just say that you're working for a business and you have a job, and because you have a job, you are spending money. Now, the way that the economy basically builds up is this idea that a product is created, people buy it, the business hires more people to make more products, and now those workers can buy additional things. So for example, Apple makes the iPhone, and they need a bunch of workers to make those iPhones. Those workers are employed, now they're earning a salary, and they can buy a bunch of other products, and a bunch of other businesses are created to make those products. Over time, this is how the economy builds up. Everyone's employed, everyone's spending money. Now, in a bank panic, the opposite happens. Some business closes, which means they lay off their workers. Now those workers don't have any money, so they can't buy anything, which causes other businesses to lose profits, which leads them to lay off workers, which means those workers can't buy anything, which means that businesses around them have to lay off workers and lay off workers and lay off workers, and the economy and the stock market crumbles. That's what happens in step 4. Now, substitute farm for business or real estate or stocks as necessary as we go. This essentially happens every 20 years. We have about a 20-year business cycle in America. It's 2022. The last time this happened in America was in 2008, so 14 years ago. That was the last recession, and it happened because of real estate investments and real estate and home prices. Ask your parents, this is around the time that you guys were like born. They probably had much different aspirations for your future when the economy was going up like crazy in the early 2000s. But then when 2008 hit, now the economy's not so good. Now maybe you don't have a sibling because of that. That's kind of how these things go. That's our guest lecturer. So that's our guest lecturer. She's upset because we stood up. Point being, this is the idea behind a bank panic. They've happened before, they will happen again. We don't call them panics anymore, we tend to call them recessions, but it's the exact same idea. All right, sweet. Take a 2-minute break and then we will continue our discussion. Okay, back to work. I just had a 2-minute coughing break myself. All right, so let's talk about whatever's next. Oh, hey, look, here's a graph. Check it out. Here is a chart of bank panics, and you can kind of see how the American economy builds and collapses. So you can see when it's at its lowest point, that's obviously when it's bad, then it builds itself up. Something happens, down. Up, something happens, down. You can see here's a big drop over here in, I realize you probably can't see my mouse. Realize over here in 2008, you can see a huge drop, and then we've been building ever since. Now this chart's a couple years old, so it hasn't been updated for the current economic downturn caused by COVID and the war in Russia and Ukraine right now. But that's essentially how this works. Hey, look, there's that cough again. That's why I'm not at school. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about land. Land is perhaps one of the most important things about the United States. Really, the story of America after the American Revolution itself, and really what causes the American Revolution itself, is our desire for land. Americans love land. So the history of America is the history of moving westward. Really, ever since the first pilgrims came to America, the very first thing they did was move inland and move west, right? So the story of everything in America relates to moving westward. Our dealings with the natives, with foreign nations, always end with the US getting more land. So you're going to read about various treaties. Guess what? If it involves getting more land, that's probably the answer. If you're going to read about treaties with Native Americans or wars with Native Americans, you want to know why every Native American conflict happened was because of getting more land. That's why. And as the class develops, the most important businesses are going to help people move west. So for example, the very first big business in America is the railroad industry. Do you want to guess what that industry does? Helps people move west. In the 1900s, the big industry is going to be the automobile because it helps people move west. And I'm sure there's some industry today that's about westward expansion in some way, because that's all we ever care about. Maybe it's the internet and the expansion of American ideals internationally. Oh, hey, that was a good answer I pulled out of nowhere. All right, sweet, so we'll use that. But speaking of land, there is always an issue in America when it comes to land. That land isn't necessarily empty. There's people there. Let's talk about Native Americans. Now, historical side note, there's a lot of discussion currently going on in the political communities and such about what phrase to use for Native Americans. Um, it turns out many Native American groups actually don't like the name Native American. Some like to be called First Nations or First Peoples or Indigenous. And in fact, even though we might bristle at using the term Indian, that's actually a phrase that some tribes actually like being referred to as. In fact, the government agency that deals with Native Americans, which is the parlance I was taught, so that's the one I use, but the agency that deals with Native Americans is called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Complicated, right? So I'm not sure what the best proper right word is for each group, and each group is different. Maybe we need to ask them and have them tell us what we should refer to them as. Make sense? Okay, so Native Americans. Native Americans always have their land taken away by the white man. And the white man always goes back on their promises to them. Now, by the way, I have white man in quotation marks because in this context, unless you are Native American, and even in some cases if you are, you're considered the white man by Native American standards. Maybe we should use this, instead of the phrase white man, we should say like outsider or something like that. We're all political outsiders to the Native Americans in this context. Now, the pursuit of land is way more important than any treaty signed with the natives. And part of what really annoys and angers the natives about dealing with the white man, as it were, is this fact that originally when the white man comes here, they say, oh, we have to have all this paperwork and all these agreements about stuff. And the Native Americans go, okay. So they learn all this weird, European legal law about land ownership, and they learn all that stuff. And then the Americans sign these treaties with them and then immediately go back on them and say, oh, those treaties don't matter. So there's this phrase among Native Americans, the white man speaks with forked tongue. That's the idea. Basically, any agreement made with the Native Americans is essentially not important because we want their land. Now, on top of that, it's not bad enough that the white man takes away the land of the Native Americans. There's going to be something else that's going to happen, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but it's this idea known as forced assimilation or acculturation. Now, what that means is that the white man is going to try to get rid of tribal identity. basically forced Native Americans to speak English, to practice Christianity, to practice European legal structures, and this is done intentionally to take away any sort of Native American tribal identity. Or, as the movie Pocahontas said, these white men are dangerous. Hey, speaking of, you guys are all living on Native American land right now. Go ahead and take a second without using Google and ask yourself, what Native American tribal land am I living on? In all the years I've taught this class, I've never had a student that knew. Will you be the one that does? What tribal land are we living on right now? This is a picture of the people that lived on this tribal land before the Europeans got here. Any idea? That's right, of course. It's the Tongva tribe. You've never heard of them. You're living on their land right now. You've never heard of them. What Tongva words do we use for anything in this region? Heck, you guys all live in an area known as Laverne. That's not Tonga or Tongva. That is Spanish, right? So we have a lot of Spanish words by us for things, but not Native American words. You are living on Tongva land right now. Moving on. Let's talk about women. So we went from one happy story. I'm sure this story will be happy, right? Are there ever any happy stories in a history class? Well, let's talk about women in America. More than 50% of the US population are women, so surely their story is going to be a positive and happy one, right? Ladies, you are constantly put down in US history and are regulated to the house. This is a concept known as domesticity. Sometimes it's called the cult of domesticity. This idea being that the home is a sphere where women have authority and women have power, and outside the home, they do not have that authority or power. Now, this concept isn't actually originally as insidious as it sounds to us today in 2022. Think about it logically. Back during the colonial era, almost every American was a farmer. So you've got one person outside dealing with the animals, and you have one person inside dealing with the kids who are also a type of animal, right? You're essentially almost kind of equal partners in the social construct of the home, right? This idea that you have one partner outside working with the animals, one partner inside taking care of the family needs, you're working to get together as a collective unit. Domesticity, as originally envisioned, isn't necessarily so bad. However, now that fewer and fewer people are farming, this idea that men are allowed to do things outside of the home and women are only allowed to do things inside of the home, regardless of their choice, that's where the problem comes from in American society. And we're going to see this split happen relatively quickly. During the American Revolution, American men and women stay in the home. You know, they're farmers, that's fine. It's really once we get to the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War, that we're going to have a lot of cultural problems with the difference between how men and women are treated. Now, ladies, that being said, during times of depression or war, ladies, you are asked to leave the home and enter the workforce, and you do so. Perhaps you've heard of Rosie the Riveter, this idea that women should enter the workforce. And that's awesome. However, do you want to guess what happens as soon as the war is over? Of course. As soon as the war is over, women are sent back into the home. And this becomes the general problem. Ladies, you're almost kind of seen as more of a tool that men can use in times of struggle rather than someone that is capable of doing your own thing and your own autonomy. Okay, so we've talked about Native Americans. That story wasn't super happy. We've talked about women. That story wasn't super happy. What story could we possibly have next that's obviously going to be happier? Let's talk about Black Americans. So, here comes another difficult story in America. Here's the problem. In 8th grade, when you learn US history, you learn the story like this. Slavery bad. Racist whites in the South are the ones that do slavery. The good whites of the North go in there, they beat all the bad whites up. The bad whites learn their lesson, slavery over, everyone happy. Welcome to 9th grade, right? That's essentially how 8th grade history goes. But like logically, that can't be how the story ends, right? But of course, in eighth grade, you're not necessarily really capable of processing the entire story. Well, welcome to the rest of the story. What happens to Black Americans in the South after the Civil War? Well, post-slavery, Black Americans are going to continue to struggle. Turns out that all of those racist whites in the South that perpetuated slavery don't just suddenly become like civil rights advocates the day the Civil War is over. In fact, it's almost the exact opposite. In many cases, and we'll talk about this, things get worse in the South for blacks, which is saying something, I know, but things get very bad in the American South because it turns out that those slave masters aren't going to treat you any better now that the Civil War is over. And in fact, it turns out the North is not some place of like racial safe haven or racial safety either for Black Americans. We'll talk about this in more nuanced detail when we get there, but it turns out the North is not some like super eager to have millions of Black refugees either. So what's to be done? How are these people helped? Well, the real answer is that they're kind of not helped at all. Throughout most of US history, Black Americans are going to struggle with something called a poverty cycle. And this is something that's extremely difficult to break out of. A poverty cycle is this idea that if you are born into a poor family, it's going to make it much more difficult to have a quality education or the same resources that someone who isn't born into a poor family would have. Which means if you don't get a good education, it's going to be much more difficult to get a higher paying job, which means that you are probably going to raise a poor family. And that poor family is going to have the same lack of quality education or limited opportunities, which means no higher paying jobs. It's a never-ending cycle. One of the discussions that happens is that like it's been 150 years or 170 years since the American Civil War. Why are there still these problems in America? Well, the big reason why is because of this poverty cycle. And it's not just Black Americans that face it. Every immigrant group, including whites in America, face this problem. The issue here is that it's going to predominantly affect the Black community because they were previously enslaved, and then when the enslavement is over, there's no safety net to help or catch them, which is going to make it so that way things get very bad very quickly for Black Americans. All right, well that's a happy story, and we're going to see that story play out in this class. What else we got? Oh, good. We're done telling sad stories. Now, let's look at some skills of a historian. So we're going to look at some pictures. Here's the thing. When a historian looks at a document, one of the first things we look at is something known as the point of view of the author. The idea being that every document that you're ever going to see, the person who made that document has a point of view about that issue. So for example, like Jeff Bezos, he's the Amazon dude. He's a businessman, so everything he ever says is about supporting Amazon. Even when he's like building a rocket to send him into space, it's about supporting Amazon. I'm sure he wants to use rockets to deliver things faster to you, right? Um, so everything we ever hear from Jeff Bezos comes from the perspective of a billionaire. Sometimes the point of view of someone is a little bit more subtle. For example, the author might like deeply believe something that would influence his or her writing, or is trying to convince you of something. So like you have to look closely at the not just the artwork that's produced, but also the point of view of the person producing it. Let's take a look at some examples and see how this works. Okay, what you are looking at is one of the first depictions of Native Americans in the New World that was done by a European. Now, again, I can't like lecture this in class and have a discussion with you guys about what you're seeing, but maybe some descriptive words that you might use for this are these Native Americans seem docile. They're nude, which also probably implies that they aren't really a threat, right? If you're a European and you have like silver-plated armor or whatever, and you see some women maybe with a bow and a stick, well, you're not really going to be all that concerned about them, right? So from the point of view of the author, it seems as if these Native Americans are not a threat, which would be the kind of verbiage and thing that you would use if you're trying to convince the investors back in Europe that, hey, this is a safe bet. There's people here, but like, They're nothing to worry about. See how the point of view maybe changed what you get out of the art? Let's look at some more. This is a couple of years later, and now maybe we have some similar opinions about what we're seeing here. We see a Native American presumed warrior over here on the left. He is also naked, so maybe that means that even though he's a warrior, he's not much of a threat. And then like we have some woman who kind of looks like a zombie over here on the right. But again, they're not threatening. And these might be the most powerful Native Americans that we'd have to fight. But if you're a European with, a musket, this is really not all that scary for you, right? So again, America's a safe investment. Send more money, send more people. It's going to be fine here. Let's fast forward a bit. Okay, it's a couple years later, and see if you notice any changes in this artwork. Now, there's a lot more going on, so the art's a little bit more complex. It's still also from the point of view of a European explorer, right? So there's not too much that we see going on up here at the top, but take a notice down here in the bottom right. See this guy with the club? Yeah, looks like he's about to bash in the head of this dude here in the center. This dude's being distracted by the three women he's talking to, and the dude behind him is about to club him in over the head. Maybe the opinion of these docile Native Americans is starting to change. Maybe they're more of a threat than we thought. Maybe we need to send some more military over here. Let's take a look at another one. Oh, this one is significantly worse, right? They're chopping up a body up here. Is there a fancy S word that you guys can think of that is often associated with Native Americans? Perhaps the word savage might be used for them. Maybe suddenly these Native Americans aren't as peaceful as we once thought they were. Maybe they're actually savages, and maybe we need more military support in order to conquer these regions. You see how the point of view is changing? Okay. One more slide, then we're done talking. Let's take a look at from the other point of view. This is a depiction. You guys tell me, what do you notice that's changed? You can pause the video. I don't have to sit here awkwardly in silence. But take a look at this painting, and you'll notice that some things have drastically changed, because it looks like the Native Americans are no longer the ones that are being the savages, as it were. Turns out, maybe it's the Europeans being savages. This was drawn by a monk during the fall of Tenochtitlan, and you can see the Spaniards, in this case, coming in and beheading the Native Americans. Suddenly, it looks as if the point of view has changed, and now the entire story has changed. Because the story of the North American conquest is very different if you are an original European settler or if you are a Native American. Wouldn't those stories be completely different, even though they're about the same thing? And that is what we mean when we talk about the point of view of the author affecting the historical story. Okay, that was a lot, but we are done. Have a good day, and I hope to see you guys soon.